Hello, my name is Carrie Eastman, and I am the author of The Energetic Goat, and I also raise a heritage breed of goat called fainting goats or myotonic goats here on Baraka Heritage Farm. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about transitioning goats from a diet with chemicals and GMOs to a chemical-free diet. There is a bit of an art and a science both to this process, and I'd like to discuss that in more detail based upon my book excerpt. So let's talk a little bit about the first month, month one. Let's assume that you've already been feeding your goats a non-organic commercial feed, your typical standard commercial feed. They will usually have various additives in them, GMO grains. There's a possibility that the grain may have been sprayed. So our first step is going to be making the food transition, and we're talking about both feed and hay. So this is about a 2-week process. You want to keep your total weight of the concentrate, and the concentrate refers to the grain. You want to keep the total weight the same. And what you're going to do is slowly start blending in your organic non-GMO concentrate, blend that into your commercial mix, increasing the amount in the blend over a 2-week period. You want to do this gradually so that you don't shock the goat system. And I also very strongly encourage you to support the goat with a good quality prebiotic. And I'll put a little side note in here. If you don't know a lot about prebiotics and probiotics, there is a post discussing this in greater depth on my blog at carrieeastman.com. And you can also read about prebiotics in the book, The Energetic Goat. It's very important to choose a prebiotic as opposed to a probiotic, and you should be giving this with every concentrate meal. And if you only feed a concentrate once a day, you may want to also give additional prebiotic on a treat about 12 hours apart from that concentrate meal to make sure they're getting plenty of gut support during this transitioning process. Also, I want to point out that generally speaking, you feed grain for energy and you feed fats for weight gain. And then alfalfa and soy are typically done for muscle and top line and protein both because of their amino acid profile. So when you're choosing your natural feed to transition your goats over to, keep in mind, are you feeding for energy? Are you feeding for weight gain or weight maintenance? Or are you looking to increase protein and build top line, which is muscling along the spine from the shoulders to the tail? So that's going to dictate what type of a blend that you use. And generally speaking, the best diet for a goat is still going to be as close to what nature intended as possible, which is a variety of browse, forage, grazing on healthy soil, because healthy soil builds healthy plants. So as much as possible, you want to depend on your browse and your graze, and then adding in a good quality hay, and then only add as little concentrate as possible to achieve the goals that you have for those particular goats. So that would be month one. You're just worrying about getting them transitioned over to their non-GMO, chemical-free diet with a good prebiotic support. Now let's talk about months 2 through 5 of transitioning your goats. You've made the transition in their forage and in their concentrates. Now we have to look at 2 different things. We have to look at rebuilding their mineral reserves if they are depleted in minerals, and most goats on a commercial diet will have some mineral deficiencies. And then secondly, we need to be looking at doing a full body cleanse, also called a detoxification, or often we just refer to it as a detox. So you're going to be looking at both of these over months 2 through 5 Now, the question becomes which one you do first, because your body generally does not clean house and rebuild at the same time. So you're going to have to pick one or the other. If you're comfortable with muscle testing, which is discussed in the book, The Energetic Goat, then you can muscle test and ask which one you should start with. If you're not comfortable with the muscle testing yet, let's talk about it logically. Generally speaking, if you have a very fragile goat, a goat that you know is very young, very old, very demineralized, maybe has been wrestling with a lot of health issues, a detox may be too harsh for that goat. They may not be able to withstand the process. So you're going to start by rebuilding the goat's mineral reserves, building a good baseline of health before you go into the cleansing phase. On the other hand, if you have a goat that isn't super fragile and you suspect that there's been a very high level of exposure to toxins, you may choose to start with your detoxification process. Either way, you're going to do both eventually. You just have to pick which of those two paths to head off on first. So, if you're going to do the detox first, let's talk about that. The most gentle and conservative detox is simply using montmorillonite clay. People also call it green clay. And this is a very, very gentle way of detoxification, and it generally works mainly in the digestive tract, in the gut. The other thing that you can do is look at the possibility of heavy metal exposure. Heavy metals can come from the soil, it can come from rainfall, and it can also be as an additive in the vaccines, or they may have been in the feed. So to get at the heavy metals, you have to address what's in the gut, but then you also have to address what's built up in the body, and particularly in the brain. There are only certain things that can cross that blood-brain barrier to remove the heavy metals from the brain. Mercury is a particular culprit in brain buildup of heavy metals. So to get at the built-up heavy metals that are within the body, and especially in the brain, the two best options that I've seen are chlorella and then a micronized form of zeolite. Zeolite is a mineral. It has a structure like a cage, and it attracts toxins. For zeolite to be effective, it has to be micronized, meaning it has to be broken down to a very small particle size. And this is discussed in more detail in the book. But you need a small size zeolite, and it also needs to be cleaned, because if it's already been exposed to toxins, it will have grabbed onto them and filled up its cage, and it doesn't have room to take on more from your goat's body. So you want a cleaned, micronized zeolite. That or chlorella are an excellent way to address the heavy metals. If you want a slightly stronger detox, you can move to an herbal detox formula. And there are many master herbalists that have good herbal detox blends. And this is discussed in the book, and there's actually a table in the back of the book that lists some options for these detox products. So your goat goes through the detox, and typically that's about a 28-day process. Once that's done, you're going to switch gears, and you're going to go into the rebuilding phase. And the rebuilding phase is when we start putting minerals back into the body. And we're not talking about just any kind of mineral. We're talking about minerals in an absorbable form that's also easy for the body to excrete. This is very important because you don't want those minerals to build up in the body and start creating problems. And additionally, these absorbable minerals, which are usually chelated minerals, either chelated naturally by a plant in the form of an herb, or chelated in a laboratory, and those would be the amino acid chelates. Chelates have this wonderful property that they also catalyze excretion and utilization. So if you have a goat that already has a buildup of these non-usable minerals, adding the chelated minerals into their diet will often help them dump that extra mineral load that they don't need and provide them with the minerals that they can absorb and use correctly. So this rebuilding process takes about 4 months to really start to rebuild your mineral foundation. And that's why we say that this phase of transitioning takes about month 2 to month 5. It's about a 4-month process. And one really important thing to note here, and that is that when a goat is going through a detox, the detox can mimic the symptoms of having a heavy parasite load. A goat going through a detox may have diarrhea, may have a runny nose, may have runny eyes, there may be skin eruptions, there could be weight loss, there could be hair loss. So these are all possible things that the body will do to dump toxins. And often when you start the mineral rebuilding phase, you may naturally trigger the goat into a detox process as well. So be aware that those symptoms can appear and they can mimic parasite symptoms. So if that happens, don't immediately assume it's parasites and treat for a parasite issue. Run a fecal check, muscle test, make sure that you know what you're dealing with. Now, if you see those symptoms and you also see a fever, you see anemia, or you see yellow or green nasal discharge, or you have bloody diarrhea, then you're likely not dealing with a detox. And in all good conscience, I have to say at that point, call your veterinarian, because we can't diagnose, treat, or prescribe. Okay, so we just finished months 2 through 5, which were doing the detox for 30 days and then starting to rebuild your mineral reserves. Next step here is months 6 through 12. So you've also transitioned your feed and your hay, you've done the detox, you've rebuilt, and now you're starting to go into a bigger phase of overall rebuilding of the body. Keep in mind, it takes 2 years to completely replace the bone in the body. So this is a long-term project that you've embarked on. But during this next time period, this is where we start to look at your deworming program, and we start to look at switching over to chemical-free deworming options. We start to re-examine your vaccination program. So let's talk a little bit about deworming. There are a bunch of ways to approach deworming without chemicals. Possible options that people have discussed over the years would include diatomaceous earth, clay, pumpkin seeds, pine needles, lespedeza, trefoil, chicory, and then there are many, many commercially available herbal blends. So a couple key points about this. The way clay works in the body on parasites, clay actually has a negative charge. And most parasites have a positive charge. It's like an opposite polarity. And so clay actually repels parasites. So it can be actually a very effective remedy against parasites. And the other neat thing about clay is that the parasites cannot adapt to it. They can't change their polarity. So you don't have an issue of the parasites developing resistance to clay. The downside of clay is it's not particularly potent. It's more of a long-term maintenance thing than something that you'd use to deal with an acute situation. So with a more acute situation, you could look at some of these other herbs that I just mentioned. Let's talk a little bit about diatomaceous earth. It's a bit of a controversial subject. There is some research out there saying that it doesn't work. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that it is effective. My own personal experience is that it's more effective long-term after it passes through the goat's body and it's on the ground and it's dealing with the parasite eggs in the ground as opposed to in the goat's body. The way diatomaceous earth works is it actually scrapes the outer skin, the outer shell of the parasite, and causes the parasite to dry out and die. Well, when the parasite's inside the body, that's a moist environment, so it's very difficult for the parasite to desiccate, dry out, and die inside the body. So that may be why it's less effective internally. But either way, try it, muscle test it, run some fecal tests before and after, and you'll figure out whether it's working well for your herd. Generally speaking, during this next time phase, you should find that you're having to reach for your chemical dewormers less and less often. If your goats are still showing a significant parasite load as you're going through this process, then you need to look at your basics a little more closely. I would particularly encourage you to look at the copper and zinc in your supplement program, because those are key for the goat having a natural resistance to parasites. And I would also look at your pasture management, and I would look at how you're feeding your hay and your concentrates. And these are addressed in a lot more detail in the book and also in my blog. So now we're going to move into months 13 through 48. We're talking now about months 13 through 48. These aren't quite what I would call the maintenance period yet, because remember, the bones are still being replaced, and that's about a 2-year process. However, during 13 through 48, you're starting to kind of settle into a rhythm here. You're continuing to revisit all the previous steps. You're continuing the healthy diet. You're increasing or decreasing the concentrates as you need to. You're continuing to refine your supplement program, adding or subtracting from your mineral buffet or to your mineral buffet to keep the goats balanced and continuing to rebuild their mineral reserves. You're continuing to look at your parasite control program. You're running fecal tests or your muscle testing, and hopefully, if you're doing this right, you're becoming less and less dependent on the chemicals, and you're able to stay ahead of the parasites with simple management practices and with herbal remedies and the clay and the diatomaceous earth. Generally speaking, this should be the trend. You should be moving forward in a positive direction of the goats being healthier, better weight, overall better coat, better color of the membranes, less dependence on the chemicals. If you're not seeing that happening, you need to go back to the basics, revisit the basics. And this is addressed in a lot more depth in the book and in my blog. And there's also a group on Facebook, a free group called Common Sense Holistic Goats. And I would encourage you to join that group because we can help you troubleshoot what's going on with your herd. And I'm also available for private consultations. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a primer about how we go about transitioning the goats onto this chemical-free lifestyle. One other point to mention, and that is that as your goats breed and you go on through the generations, each successive generation should have a greater degree of health, a greater natural degree of parasite resistance, a greater adaptation to a lower concentrate input, and a higher ability to use a good quality browse or forage to maintain. So over the generations, you should also be seeing these type of improvements. And if you're not, then again, you need to go back and look at your foundation. So thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Have a great day.